Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this month for Side by Side Digital. I'm your host, Rebecca Shively, and we've got a great program lined up for you today. This month, we're talking about how to prepare your family farm for the future state of agriculture. We're joined today by Hans Riensche. Hans is a sixth-generation farmer from Northeast Iowa. Hans also works as an intelligence analyst with Aimpoint Research, a global strategic intelligence firm specializing in agriculture. Thank you for being here today. We're really excited to welcome you, and we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. So be sure to submit those questions, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. It's really fun to be coming, out of the crowd. I normally am on these, but as a participant, so this is super fun to be up here. But as Rebecca introduced, my name is Hans Riensche, and I'm excited to talk to you here. So I'll go ahead and share my slides, and we'll kick this off. All right. So a bit about the background of this topic is really personal to me. Grew up on a family farm, but then also I've been working on having a job outside of farming for a couple of years until I can maintain coming back into the family farm full time, which is what led me to Aimpoint Research. See, in this job, with this group of people who mostly come from a military intelligence background, what we do is we keep track of a lot of the consumer, agricultural, global trends that impact farming and what technologies are coming up, and then look for the ways to apply those to businesses operating in the ag space to help make sure that we're always pushing in the right direction with what we're doing as an ag industry. And so to start off, I'll tell you a little bit about our family's farm. We farm in Northeast Iowa, over a little town called Jessup, over by Waterloo. Family moved over from Germany, and that's where the train stopped. So that's where they started farming. But we raise corn, soybeans, and wheat. And I, along with my three sisters, we are the sixth generation of our family to be farming here. We've made the giant trek 1 mile down the road from where we originally landed. But in the bottom right is a picture of my sisters, my parents, myself, and my brother-in-law, who are all actively involved in our farming operation. However, we are branded as Blue Diamond Farming Company. It's kind of a funny story how we ended up being named this. We are not the almond people, but our last name is incredibly hard to spell. The local co-op decided that there was blue diamonds on the side of the truck, so they'd start writing that on the scale tickets. And so away we went. They did our branding for us. But so that's stuck with us. And I always bring it up at the beginning because it's something that a lot of groups are not always willing to be receptive to change from outside people and willing to adapt. But that's something that we've internalized in our farming operation. And we've kept that as we look at what kind of partnerships and groups that we want to start with our farm. And we prioritize getting into relationships with different agricultural companies or disruptors who have the ability to be additive in the way that they bring value to our farm, that they also encourage us to think differently and to look for opportunities we might not have normally thought about as we would have continued our typical production methods over periods of time. So that's a bit about our farm, but I want to talk about what we want to maybe go through here today. And so what I want to walk us through is just a brief, skipping over the top of the waves, a status of the U.S. agricultural economy, a lot of things that we are very familiar with. But then we maintain a consumer tracker survey. We are constantly keeping our pulse on what consumers across the United States are thinking about food. We weight this to make sure that we cover all the different demographics of consumers. And whatever those demographics may be, so that we can keep up on what they're asking from the food system, and we can actively predict out what we need to maybe start thinking about on our farms. Then we'll start talking about how we see those changes actually evolving in the ag space, what those mean directly for operations across the Farm Credit Services of America geography. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the process of getting involved with some of these groups and what that can look like for an operation. So let's dive right into a brief status of the U.S. ag economy. So the 4 topic areas I want to go into here are going to be labor, input prices, farm policy, and expanding demand. These are things that we're all familiar with on this call. So we're just going to do a quick level set on the status, some numbers to these. Something which is really interesting is that we talk a lot about the current job environment and the current labor environment. just as of the last month, we've finally approached reaching the pre-COVID levels of a number of employees holding jobs in the United States. That after about 2 years, a recovery period, which to some is longer, to some is shorter than what we expected, we're finally seeing some form of normalization. However, this normalization hasn't been necessarily uniform across the entire US economy. And if we look specifically, we can find ourselves over here on the right that agriculture has had specifically a tough time pulling workers back as workers begin to start thinking about where they may have moved during COVID or what they maybe have prioritized for what they want to get out of a job. And so we see that, yes, labor is coming back, but not necessarily maybe exactly the way it was before, which was a troublesome thing for agriculture to begin with. If we look at the impacts of inflation, we see that inflation, short supply, transportation costs, lockdowns, all of these have driven up input costs. We all know that from putting in a crop this year. It was not fun to buy anhydrous this spring. But when we look at the current US inflation rate, it's finally stabilized. It's just happened to stabilize at the highest rate that it has since 1981. It's not a lot of fun, but what becomes really interesting in analyzing the US inflation rate is that while the CPI for all goods in the United States has stabled off at 8.3%, we've seen energy be up to 30%, and food inflation has actually maintained its course of inflation and is now moving to 9.4%. And there's become this divergence between the commodity sector and the general economy when it comes to inflation, which is part of the reason why we see increased prices for fertilizers, for commodity grains, and you name it. Let alone we bring up some of the global shortfalls and the issues that we're seeing in the Black Sea region. Then something else we're familiar with is the fact that America is urbanizing as a country. COVID has kind of pushed maybe more people out from the major metropolitan areas to some more of the more semi-rural, these regions that maybe are 30 to 50, 100,000 people cities instead of the several million major cities. However, even some of that is beginning to reverse as COVID lockdowns and other protocols begin to ease across the nation. But in addition to the fact that rural areas are losing population and that they are losing representation in the House of Representatives and the Senate Ag and the House Ag committees, we also see that America is slowly, or that the American agricultural system is not necessarily losing the Farm Bill, but it's losing influence in the Farm Bill. And that over time, the Farm Bill has increasingly become a nutrition bill. And if we look at the numbers from the last Farm Bill, which came out from 2019, we see that nutrition now makes up 76% of the Farm Bill. And when it comes to influencing the decisions of policymakers, there are now over 20 times as many people on food assistance as there are farmers in the country. And so when they are looking for voices that vote, maybe we are losing some of our influence in this sphere. Then the last one is the one that we hear about constantly, which is there is a decreasing number of farmers, there is a decreasing amount of farmland, and there is an increased there's an increasing middle class, which is looking for food, and it's looking specifically for meat. And the challenge of producing falls upon us, and that we can see that especially as this growing middle class wants meat, which takes more calories to produce than comes out of it. Although there is higher quality protein and nutrition out of that meat, it's going to require a lot more out of our ag systems across the globe in order to meet those demands that those consumers expect of us. But let's dive a little bit deeper into what consumers in general are actually wanting from the ag system. And what we see is that consumers' needs and what consumers ask for from the ag system, sometimes they're portrayed very negatively in the ag space. However, they're much more in line with the things that maybe we want on our farms than we might actually give them credit to. The first thing is that consumers want improved nutrition. That when we start looking at younger demographics of consumers, specifically the millennials and Generation Z, they have a much greater focus on nutrition than previous generations. And there's this interest in watching not just the quantity of calories that a person consumes, but looking at the quantity, or not just the quantity, but also looking at the quality of those calories. We've grown up in an era where people have seen the results of dietary disease and the very grave impacts it's had. And this is on consumers' minds. And the agricultural system is slowly adapting to, or maybe not slowly, but it is adapting to maybe meet some of these needs. We see companies like Brightseed, which analyze molecules in plants which have beneficial properties for human health. And we see them breeding different varieties of fruits and vegetables that will then be, which are then cultivated and sold to consumers. We also see groups like Benson Hill and Inari and Unfold, which are breeding major commodities to also have better properties to improve the nutritional qualities of what we provide consumers. Then we also see consumers are looking for carbon scoring. And what this really underscores, which is very interesting, is that consumers, more than they necessarily want a score itself to understand their carbon footprint, they want to have the ability to make decisions on it, because that's something which hasn't really been maybe tangible in the past. But groups like Carbon Calories, which help translate the carbon impacts of food you consume into a very understandable and actable system, like the one here shown for coffee at home. This is something that consumers are going to want to know, but it also comes with some asks from the agricultural system. And in the United States, this is mostly being done right now from the private market. But on the bottom left of this section is the eco impact scores. This is the system that the European Union uses to assign the level of impact a particular food item has on the actual environment, and lets a consumer make a decision on whether they want to consume it based on its impact. But while this does originally sound like a challenge for agriculture, it also comes with some opportunities. And we'll dive deeper into these a little bit later. But much of the same systems which are needed to understand these scores, which are not meant to be a penalty, just a benchmark, are the same things that are needed to help actually get enrolled in maybe some income producing systems like carbon or ecosystem markets. The next thing I want to bring up about what consumers are asking and what we constantly track from them is they want a transparent food system. And once again, this is something which is definitely stepping up as we get towards the younger generations of consumers. We see this massively with millennials and Generation Z that, hey, they want to know everything about their food so they can make those educated decisions. And they're seeing this especially in areas like the sustainability and the transparency of that food. And of course, transparency, they want to know how and why you produced. But why is really much more important than how, because when we look at studies that come out to show the way that consumers perceive farmers and the people who produce their food, it's a 5-to-1 split in favor of them being interested in your values as a producer over maybe necessarily just the facts that you can present as a producer. They're not really so worried about whether you did tillage. They're more concerned on why you did it and whether you had their best interest in mind, which gives a really wonderful spot for us as producers to maybe bridge some of the gaps. But speaking some of the gaps in the ways that we perceive and convey information to consumers have a really different lens about farming and the environment than we might in agriculture today, writ large. And that is that when consumers are working on affecting policy across the world and the United States, typically most of it is put into a frame of the ESG lens, which the ESG system kind of allows people to understand the externalities that come from an action. What are your impacts on the environment? What are your impacts on society? And how are you held accountable for what you decide to do in your operation? It's safe to say that agriculture has been concerned and has been working diligently to improve the environmental impacts. It's something that's super tangible in our industry. And we see it when we see the ecosystem markets and we see people adopt certain practices. This is top of mind. What has not always been top of mind has been the impacts that our operations have on our local communities and our communities writ large across the nation. And this is something where we have room to continue to advance. And as we advance, this is something that goes into those shared values that we talk about with consumers to help them understand that we're always looking for a variety of ways that we can ever improve every part of our operation. And the last thing, the governance side of ESG is the system by which you ask yourself, are you being accountable for your actions? If I say, hey, you know what, I want to decrease soil erosion on my farm, and I have no mechanism to go in and check and see whether I actually have done this, then there's no governance in the system. But if you say, hey, I'm going to have a study done at the end of the year, measure the depth of the soil, and then I'm going to go ahead and have this sample checked over by a friend who is maybe impartial to what I do. This is a governance system. This is a system which becomes very tangible for an operation to make sure that, hey, I said that I wanted to work with this community or this environmental objective, and this is the system by which I'm going to validate that I'm actually doing what I said I wanted to and am doing to be able to continuously make improvements. And we see that consumers really feed off of this system because it addresses most of their needs that they brought forward at this time. And that consumers and employees are much more willing to purchase or work with companies that set forth some form of environmental, social, or governance standard, and they adhere to it. And if we see here on the left is a chart that shows to which level companies are much more likely to purchase or work for someone who adheres to those. And on the right, we can see the response of the free market being that major global Fortune 500 companies with ESG commitments has been on the rise because they recognize that, hey, if they want to stay relevant to this changing consumer base, they need to go ahead and begin adopting and adapting their operations. And this is extended into the food space because consumers, as they look at any company, look at their food companies, and they want to ask, hey, what are you doing to make the world around you a better place? And they're putting a variety of asks on these companies, and companies are responding with different environmental goals. And on this page, I've only highlighted the environmental goals for just for the example to show the growth of this, because it starts with maybe the food companies, but it expands that in order for them to meet the objectives that they put forward, the surrounding companies who also play in the same supply chain have begun to either make their own objectives that play into the end food systems objectives, but then also to try and improve their operations as well. And this is now moving from being something which has been voluntary, mostly in the past, to being something which is required. And that we see that the SEC just recently they just announced that they are asking any publicly traded company to now disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. However, the dust hasn't fully settled on what this means yet, because does the greenhouse gas emissions that need to be reported to the SEC, does it stop at the end at the door of the company on the way out, or does it go all the way back to the farm gate? And that's not really decided yet, but we know that we'll see that pan out in the future. So let's talk about how some of this has actually impacted the farm itself. Now we can move on from some of the major trends. And if we look at the changes in production, we can slice those into three main buckets. And that's going to be advancements in production, it's going to be external factors, and changes in data and digitization. So in those production advancements, we're going to talk about autonomous solutions that have rolled out, precision farming solutions, different types of inputs, new cropping systems, and some changes in the livestock system that all are technologies that could possibly have an impact on our farms. So let's talk about the autonomous space, and let's get it out of our system. So we've already seen everyone wants to talk about, hey, you know what? We could have autonomous tractors. Hey, we can free up a laborer, or hey, I can free up myself to go do some other work that's important to the farm. That's really important, but that's only one thing to think about in the autonomous space. What becomes really interesting is if you don't need to go across every acre, but you can have a machine do it, this opens up for things like robotic agronomy, where a machine can go across and scan each plant and determine micronutrient deficiencies or help you improve the yield of that crop and see things that maybe your naked eye couldn't. It opens the door for drone applications, because now that we have technologies that are advanced enough that we can go in the middle of the season when we usually wouldn't have machinery be able to go out and perform tasks, we now have those capabilities because of the advancements in robotics. We also have seen that maybe the entire idea that farming needs to be done with massive machinery can be rethought, and that there are different types of machines being rolled out. This bottom one is from Fendt. This is a corn planter that, wait, instead of buying a 12-row corn planter, maybe I should have 12 units of a small autonomous fleet that if one unit goes down on my 12-row corn planter, I have to get out and all 12 rows stop for a long period of time. And if I have to wait 2 days for parts, I lost a lot of productivity. However, if one unit goes down on a swarm system, I still have 11 rows planting, and that's just fine if they're all independent and they all operate on GPS and function autonomously. When we move into precision farming techniques, which have evolved recently, we've got in-season nutrient monitoring. And we've always had prescription, not always, but we've had prescription fertilizer and seed for a while. But sensors are coming out that can tell you your in-season soil moisture, or they can tell you your fertility rates in real time. That this can have a massive impact on farms, because if you can begin to adapt your production in the middle of the season in real time without needing long, in-depth agronomic tests, we can act faster and improve yields and improve productivity much quicker. We also see technologies like biosensing, the ability to take your phone and scan a crop and determine what that crop might need just simply with a camera. It's fascinating. And groups like Interplant are working on this, creating plants which actually respond to certain deficiencies by turning a color, whether it's visible to the naked eye or not, and it can help you change your production system. We also see AI coming in, artificial intelligence, with things like John Deere Seed and Spray, where we ask ourselves the question of, like, how resource efficient are we being to put a burn down pass on an entire field, when maybe we just need to target the spots in the field which have been impacted by a weed. Let's move into the alternative inputs. On one hand, we've all seen biological nitrogen come out. The idea that maybe we don't need to be reliant on a system where nitrogen is imported or produced far away, but we can actually create it within our own soils with microbes. We've also seen that there might be replacements to some of the ag products that we use today that maybe consumers might like. For example, Harpy Biosciences has created a biological replacement for glyphosate with most of the same functionality. And it's not yet a totally finished product, but the idea of it being that if you wanted to tell your consumer, hey, I know that maybe you don't follow the whole story on chemicals, but you want something that's chemical free, maybe delivering on that isn't as difficult in the long run in 5-10 years from now as we might think about it being today. But then there's also things that get really interesting. For example, green ammonia, which green ammonia is the idea that we can co-locate the production of fertilizer with the production of crops on farms, that we can use energy from renewable sources. We can take nitrogen out of the air and combine it with hydrogen out of water on a farm in Iowa and South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, anywhere, and we can create the fertilizer that we need at that production location instead of needing to try and pull it in from lots of other places. But also, ammonia can be used as a fuel for machinery. Brings a lot of opportunities. We also see lots of new cropping systems emerging. And one of those is harvestable cover crops. Groups like Covercress are producing a winter oil seed, which in the past, a cover crop could only be tilled back in, which has great benefits. However, it's not always economically viable in the short term. Working to solve the economic viability by being able to sell maybe what you grew and then go back and still plant another full season crop afterwards. This could change the landscape for how we actually incorporate our current cropping systems. Then there's also advancements in things like perennial grains. The Land Institute is getting kerns off the ground. They've got it on 2,000 acres, but this is a long-term play. Why are we always growing crops we have to till over and farm the next year? Great question. It's just what we have. But maybe that in itself will change over time. And then we also see that, in the greatest twist of irony of all time, as people worry about cattle emissions, maybe the fuel in maybe fuel can be made from the byproducts of our farms, and things that we are criticized for today could become massive opportunities for us in the long run. We've seen groups like Chevron, who's also invested in renewable diesel, and they've invested in some green ammonia projects, that they have stepped into the bioenergy markets, and they are looking at ways to take methane from cattle manure and turn it into fuel, renewable fuel. But then let's not alienate livestock production. So I as a corn, soybeans, and wheat farmer, have to make sure I never do that. But some really cool things are rolling out here as well. So we see that where AI is improving the ability for us to control weeds in fields, it's also improving our abilities to monitor crops. Groups like Canvas have technology where cameras can scan and identify cattle, and then as they identify them, they can find out whether, hey, this cow is responding in a way which indicates that maybe she's developing mastitis. And as an operator, you can change that on your dairy, or separate her off and help her get treated back. Or you can do this this is now expanding into more livestock than just cattle, but it can improve the ability of the operator to maintain and manage those animals in a more efficient fashion. We also see that technologies are rolling out that help manure management. Groups like Poly Clean Tech have developed a solution that, when mixed with livestock manure, turns it into an ash-like powder. So that way, you don't need to have open pits of manure outside of hog buildings, but instead it could be more quickly turned into a more economical fertilizer for farm operations. We also see people like Beef Chain who are rolling out blockchain verification systems to help validate some of the claims that go into food products, to make sure that they are indeed what we tell consumers they are. And this helps improve the trust in the food system, making things a bit more transparent. But then ag is also going to change from a variety of external factors as well. First one of those is that we've seen production region shift. We've seen production expand outside of areas that have been hit with drought. We've seen it push north and west. We've seen the Dakotas become a much larger agricultural producing region for corn and soybeans. They've always been ag producers. But production is changing as people leave some of the urbanizing coasts and leave some areas that are facing consistent climatic issues. We see ag is also responding to the demand for advanced renewables, and that the push for things like sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel create fantastic opportunities for demand for corn and soybeans, which, if all of them were used to make these fuels that are asked for, we would not be able to fully fill that demand over time. There's also potential opportunities for the improved co-location of renewable energy generation. Right now, it's tentative because it takes ag land out of production. However, when we look at systems like agrivoltaics, this might not always be the same in the future, that we might be able to co-locate using or collecting energy and also creating crops. But the last thing which gets really interesting in external factors is going to be the fact that we're seeing ESG-linked programs rolling out from a variety of different servicers. So one of those is, if you are working with Farmers Business Network and you get one of their lines of credit, you can actually get up to a 0.5% interest rebate if you adhere to certain environmental protocols based on about 70% of your acres. And that matters in an era where interest rates are rising. We also see that in the past that the USDA has attached your premiums for crop insurance to whether or not you planted a cover crop. And more recently, very recently, we've seen that the ERP programs have now rolled out, and that there are certain stipulations that the relative level that you can get paid for being in the ERP program depends upon more factors than just your production. It also takes into account status, also like if you are considered a historically underserved producer. And for that, your productivity can change. Right, wrong, or indifferent, these are the changes that we're seeing in the ag space, and we can expect to see more of these because the consumer base is asking for this and prioritizing it. And this is also serves as a reminder to go check out the ERP payments. because if you do want to enroll in crop insurance, over the next 2 years, it's a fantastic program that'll help you possibly offset some of those costs that are going to come with it as long as your county is eligible. But then the last thing to talk about is the influence of data and digitization in agriculture, which is data and digitization will improve operational efficiencies. It can validate the differentiation that you do on your farm and help you participate in new markets. And over the past 2 decades, we've spent a lot of time collecting data on farms. And this data is collected from a variety of sources, but data has always been very disconnected. But right now, there's a change that in the next decade, or the current decade, we're beginning to look at systems which promote data integration. And data integration, bringing it all into one system, allows us to find a variety of uses for it. So in the first kind of tier of uses, and these build upon each other, is simply things like yield maps, GPS guidance, understanding what you're using for irrigation, and taking soil samples and changing your productivity accordingly. But these give birth to the ability to maybe then make advanced agronomic decisions, like putting out your fertilizer and seed prescriptions, or employing swath control, or deciding off the data you collect whether to adopt or remove a practice. And having this much information allows you to get involved in the carbon or an ecosystem service market, or to partake in a traceability-based market. And we see that these are rolling out, and people who have some form of data program are generally at an advantage in them. But it makes us ask, what's next? And what we've seen coming next is that groups like the European Union are working on releasing carbon scored exports, or they're going to require carbon scores on imports coming in, which would be exports for us. That we see that the government is ramping up some of their traceability mandates for food safety. And we also see that there will be further opportunities for farmers with information behind their products to gain premiums for producing differentiated products as we go forward. So when it comes to what we do about all of these trends, all of these technologies on our farming operations, what do we actually do to get involved in this? And what's the very tangible things that we can see from it? Well, I would break up the process of getting involved with groups like this into 3 different chunks. There is the developing a foundation for what you want to get involved with, exploring the options, and then getting engaged. So developing a foundation for getting involved with groups, the first thing is understand what you're willing to take on as a risk tolerance. Because if you are going to try and get involved with a group that does green ammonia, for example, you should know how much you're willing to put forward and take a risk on, because you should always think about the experimentation you do on your farm as a budget item and not a surprise expense. And what I mean by that is, like, hey, I have $500 to throw at this, or I have 10 acres I can throw at this, but don't bite off more than you're willing to chew. The second thing, which is going to be important for interacting with groups, is going to be adopting a digital ag platform. Most of everything which we've talked about here today has built on some level of data, and that's going to be critical moving forward. Then the next thing is, as you interact with groups outside of agriculture or outside of mainstream agriculture, they're going to want to know a lot about you. I would suggest going to build an online presence for your farm. Groups like WordPress and let you do that for free online, or just simply having a Facebook page to talk about your operation, where you're at today, and why you want to get involved with someone outside of ag who wants to make a difference. Next is make sure that you inform relevant stakeholders, family and landlords. If you're doing anything on ground, which you might rent, or if you're going to do this with production that you share with other people, make sure that they know what's going on. Most people are supportive of a good learning process, but it's just always good to make sure that that's done. And the last thing is to make sure you develop some form of mission statement for what you're working on, and it demonstrates your values in terms that a consumer might understand. Because the best way that we in ag can connect with people who either have technologies or simply want to know about agriculture is to speak their language. And we definitely can with a little bit of effort from us. Then, when it comes to the exploration of finding opportunities, I would say that the best thing to do is to to start reading some really, there's a couple of resources I would absolutely suggest. Groups like the Yield Lab, Seed to Growth Ventures, Ag Funder News, the Combine, which is based in Nebraska, and Illinois Ag Tech Accelerator, which pushes technology which is relevant to our geography, but they don't they don't close out. Anyone from any geography is able to come in and step in and be a mentor to some of their startups. Just getting an exposure to what is going on can kind of stir up some ideas of maybe what's possible for an individual's farming operation. Then the next thing is you don't have to bear all the risk yourself. That the AMS puts out a series of grant opportunities for people who want to do some form of market development, specifically for agricultural goods. And some of the risks that could be brought into an operation that are either too great for an operation to bear, or just would be better offset. There's a lot of grant programs which can help actually do that, so your risk is mitigated. Then the next thing I'd say is, as you look through these, only really get involved with things that you genuinely care about. If you're really interested in soil conservation or carbon emissions, go after those things in particular, because they end up being quite a bit of work, but they're definitely worth it in the long run if you are passionate about it. And be willing to accept that not everything's going to be the right fit. That it's fine to get 3 conversations into working with a group, and then to be willing to say, hey, maybe this isn't what's going to work for us. Been there many a time, and been glad to go our ways afterwards. But then the last question is, how do we really get involved with groups like this? And the first thing is, let's just use Corteva as an example. A lot of these external ag groups that want to get into farming operations start working with people who already have a footprint in agriculture, like Corteva, which works with both indigo and granular. They actually own granular, and so they are through their relationships that they presently maintain. They usually have some form of incentive for a sales rep to get involved, and that person can be a doorway for you to maybe learn more about that technology or product. Then sometimes it's as simple as reaching out on company websites or LinkedIn. If you find a person who's doing something interesting, find out, or get a hold of their investors. Their investors are always looking for them to get more traction in a marketplace, or discuss possibly doing some form of trial, or just looking for ways to grow the company that they're partial to. But the last thing, which is probably the most important, is once you build a relationship, it's important to be welcoming, understanding, and patient, because a lot of the people who are in this ag tech space, they're very knowledgeable topic experts about something, and sometimes that something is not agriculture. And being someone who works on a farm, you probably have a very strong understanding of agriculture, of course, but sometimes that disconnect helps stimulate some ideas that maybe wouldn't have normally been brought about. We've definitely found that in our work. But as long as you can help them understand ag in a respectful way, they can better serve your operation and bring opportunities for what can maybe happen on your operations in the future. So with that, I will turn it over. I see we have a question or two in the chat, and would love to hear any of your thoughts.
Great, thanks, Hans. A lot of really great information to digest there. It looks like we do have a couple questions coming in, and we got some time here, so definitely feel free to submit those. Someone has a question for you and kind of your personal operation. Can you tell us a little bit about some specific changes maybe you've made on your farm or you're looking at making in the next year or so?
Absolutely. So one of the big changes I made this year was I started looking at what consumers wanted out of soybeans. And that there's been this push for a long time to get involved with high oleic groups. And there's been premium market opportunities to start growing those kinds of crops. And so I reached out to, in my case, in particular, was Benson Hill, and said, hey, I'm interested. I'm willing to do like one field that I rent, and it's a 40-acre field. And I was like, I can do that. That's my most at risk I can take on this year. And I am now growing those beans, which is kind of nice on one hand that they are a non-GM high oleic soybean, because it's hard to find dicamba and it's hard to find Liberty at this time like we normally would use. And so that's been a change. And so logistics and shipping those is a little bit more difficult, but that's one change I've made directly Another one, we've incorporated a lot of biologicals on our acres to try and improve nutrient use efficiency. And we've seen some results in places. We've seen some spots where we haven't seen them.
Awesome. I think that's a really great example of kind of that incremental change that you were talking about. So trying it out on kind of a small scale and seeing if it's something you want to pursue in the future. I guess kind of a follow-up to that question. I know you mentioned working with your family and being involved and your sisters. Can you talk a little bit about kind of if you have an idea or you want to propose a change, how to get kind of the family on board and, get that buy-in if you want to do something a little bit different? I know we hear sometimes that's hard. Sometimes the older generation might be a little resistant. Can you talk about maybe some strategies that you've used that you found to be successful?
Absolutely. So I have, it's a bit of a blessing that I have. My oldest sister is very innovative in the way that she thinks. So I can usually I find someone in my family that I can usually pull on my side and who also shoots. And then I also find someone else in my family who shoots me straight. And they say, hey, okay, I've got support from one side and I've got someone who says, hey, Hans, I know that you were like super excited about maybe incorporating an entirely different crop. Let's just say like millet for some reason. And you're like, and then they can be kind of the truth in the situation and say like that's not going to work in our current production model and the economics don't work. So this really isn't something that we can see in the long run. But I also have someone who's going to support and say, hey, I like the idea that you're pushing. And when I have that balance, it helps me build an argument that I can bring forward to maybe, my parents and say, hey, would you be willing to consider going in with me? So I can take the risks on the parts of the operation that are my own, that maybe they're not large, but I can try those out there and then expand it further as we see it either succeed, if it does.
I like it. So really surrounding yourself with kind of a diverse team, people who might challenge your viewpoint, but also people who are going to back you up if they think that you've really thought out your idea and it's a good one.
Yeah. And one thing I would add to that is, it's typically that we do these things within a family, but I also do some work like this with friends. Maybe we want to try out a biological on an acre, and I've got a friend who farms 5 miles away and say, hey, did you want to try 20 acres of this? I wanted to try 20 acres of this. And we can go in together if the minimum box size is 40 and say, hey, we split our risk. We tried this together. Maybe the circle gets a little bit wider than family to close friends as well.
Good to have those folks in your network who are willing to come along. You had mentioned some of kind of the risks, and like you just said, there's ways to mitigate some of those risks. Can you say a little bit more about some of the risks maybe associated with some of these new things coming out and maybe some steps people can take to really think through and think about how to avoid or mitigate some of those risks?
Absolutely. So there generally tends to be opportunities for everyone's different level of ability to take on risk. And so for some, you have like, let's say we have enrolled in the carbon market. There is a 1 year that you promise that you're going to keep those acres in. There's no long-term risk on it. And you don't have to do much in the way of changing your practices. Just report back in the information about what you've done over the last 5 years. And they'll determine if you did anything that's eligible. And they'll make suggestions about what you could do in the future. And so for no cost to me other than my time, I'm able to enroll and check it out. And possibly, I think I got like $3 an acre from that year. And like, hey, it was enough to get your feet wet and be like considering maybe in the long run I could justify a cover crop or something like that based on these payments in addition to other things I'm working on. But then there's also things that take on a little bit more risk, and like the mid step, like okay, so the far side is if you like the Benson Hill soybeans, if you raise those, you are on a contract to produce it. There's definitely like act of God clauses in there that hey, if you lose your entire production this year, they're not going to come after you. It's just fine. But you take the risk that, hey, I'm going to change my production. That's definitely a risk. But in the mid ground is opportunities where there'll be revenue guarantees. Sound Agriculture was this way for us last year, was that they were said, hey, use our product on these acres. You'll buy the product, but if your revenue doesn't move above, I think it was break even, that they would reimburse your revenue up to that point. And for us on that particular product on those acres, it ended up being about a break even. We shook hands and we looked for different spots to maybe incorporate that next year. So there are opportunities to go full risk, but there's a whole suite of people who are willing to either guarantee your revenue or things that are very, very low risk to help you get involved collecting information to apply to your farm in the future.
Great, really good to know about those. It looks like we have time for maybe one more question, one more that came in. So you talked about consumer trends, and the question here is, with new demands coming from consumers, at what point do we feel like we're caving to demands if some of those demands maybe aren't backed in benefits for producers or consumers? So how to kind of sift through that noise to figure out maybe what are the trends worth paying attention to?
I think that's a fantastic question. And the thing that gets interesting is, in the mind of consumers, farming is not necessarily too much different than most other goods that they purchase. And that your the company that makes your t-shirt doesn't say like, hey, look, we're going to tell you about how you made your t-shirt. They're going to say, hey, this is what you wanted, we'll provide it. Now ag gets a little bit different because someone still had to grow the cotton for that t-shirt, and someone had to produce it. But where we strike a balance is going to be that we can make incremental changes over, and we can explore with things that they want to see. And as long as we demonstrate our shared values of why we change our production and maybe meet what they want, if we can demonstrate, hey, actually this is the negative consequence that came from it, we tried it valiantly, we tried it with what you had in mind, and then can relay back, maybe this isn't why it happened, and we value the sustainability of the land, so we're not going to do this super intensive cropping system. That's something that resonates better than just saying, no, we're not going to do it. And people are much more receptive, as we've seen, to being incorporated in your value system as you try to make those changes, and that just absolutely makes it go better.
Great advice to end with. We are at the end of our time here. So I want to thank you, Hans, for taking time and spending some time with us and walking us through kind of some of the things that you're seeing in your role. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Great questions and participation coming through. And we'll be back here next month on July 6th, where we'll be talking about the difference between working in your business versus on your business. So that should be a really great topic. We hope you'll join us on July 6th. Until then, take care, and we hope to see you online soon.